entire American town picked up and left, not over decades, not because the work dried up or the railroad never came. They left because something in the forest was killing them, and no one could explain how. By 1950, there was nobody. The post office was shut down. The Federal Registry erased the name. The buildings were left standing with the doors unlocked and the dishes still on the shelves, and in 75 years, not one family has ever gone back to live there. The bodies they pulled from the streams didn't have claw marks. They didn't have bite wounds. They were broken, crushed, the way a thing gets crushed when something enormous picks it up and throws it. The men who died were not tourists. They were not lost hikers. They were seasoned woodsmen who knew every cove and every game trail for miles, and they vanished in broad daylight, in calm weather, on routes they had walked 100 times. For decades, the official answer was nothing at all. The disappearances were filed and forgotten. A wartime investigation closed without naming a cause. The whole story sank into the wet green silence of the Kenai Peninsula, repeated only as a campfire rumor. The town the monster emptied. Then, in recent years, researchers went back. They collected the oral histories the elders had been guarding for generations. They documented the site, the track impressions, the strange structures in the trees, the sounds that come out of the dark. And what they found doesn't make the story smaller. It makes it worse. Because the deeper they looked, the more the convenient explanations fell apart, and the harder it became to say the indigenous people who lived there were wrong about what they had been warning outsiders about since before America even owned Alaska. I'm Professor Edmund Quinn. For most of my life, I treated stories like this the way any reasonable person does, as folklore dressed up to explain misfortune. But Portlock is not a story that behaves like folklore. Folklore doesn't leave a body count. Folklore doesn't depopulate a working cannery town and keep the survivors away for 3/4 of a century. So I want to take you somewhere very few people have ever stood. I want to walk you through exactly what happened on that lonely stretch of the Alaskan coast, what the new investigations uncovered, and why the answer they arrived at unsettles me far more than the legend ever did. Let's begin with what Portlock actually was, because the version most people imagine, some ramshackle frontier camp, is completely wrong. Portlock was a real, functioning community on the southwestern tip of the Kenai Peninsula, on the southern coast of Alaska. It was built around a cannery established in 1921, and it took its name from a British naval officer, Nathaniel Portlock, who had charted those waters back in 1786. So even the name carried more than a century of history before the first cannery piling was ever driven into the mud. By the late 1920s, Portlock had grown into something stable. Not a tent city, not a seasonal labor camp that folded when the salmon run ended. At its peak, it held roughly 150 people. It had a school where children learned their letters. It had a medical clinic. It had a post office that connected it to the rest of the country, docks that received the boats, and a salmon fishery that fed canneries up and down that whole stretch of coast. These are the markers of permanence. You do not build a school for a place you intend to abandon. You do not staff a clinic for a town that isn't meant to last. Portlock had the full infrastructure of a community planning to be there for generations, and then, within a single generation, it was gone. Completely, permanently gone. The town was never resettled. It doesn't appear on most modern maps of Alaska. If you went looking for it today, you would find collapsed pilings rotting in the tidal flats, the skeletal remains of structures slowly being swallowed by moss and devil's club, clearings the forest has almost finished reclaiming. 75 years of silence. And here is the detail that should stop you. In all that time, with the harbor still protected, the salmon streams still running thick, the building sites still cleared, nobody has gone back. In a state where remote homesteads and abandoned cabins get reclaimed constantly by people hungry for land and isolation, Portlock alone stays empty. As if there's an understanding, passed quietly from one generation to the next, that you simply do not go there to stay. To understand why, you have to understand the place itself, because the geography is not a backdrop to this story. The geography is a character in it. The southwestern tip of the Kenai Peninsula is a labyrinth of rocky coves and narrow harbors crouched beneath mountains that rise 3,000, 4,000 feet almost straight up out of the salt water. The slopes are blanketed in old-growth forest, and beneath that canopy, the understory grows so dense, so tangled with brush and downed timber and head-high ferns, that a person standing 10 feet off the trail can simply cease to exist. You could walk past them and never know. Sound dies in there, light barely reaches the ground, and it is cut off from everything. There were no roads to Portlock in 1921, and there are no roads to it now. Then and today, the only way in is by boat or by float plane. That meant the people who lived there were hours from the nearest settlement, and if anything went wrong, weeks from any kind of law enforcement. Imagine that. Imagine living somewhere where, if the worst happened, there was no one to call, and even if you could call, no one could reach you in time. You were on your own, with the mountains at your back, and the cold ocean in front of you, and a wall of green forest pressing in from every side. So why on earth would anyone build a town in a place like that? The answer is simple, and it's the same answer that built half of coastal Alaska: the fish. Salmon canneries were built where the salmon were, and Portlock had everything the industry wanted: a protected harbor where boats could shelter from the brutal weather of the Gulf of Alaska. Salmon streams so productive they practically guaranteed a profitable season, and, crucially, available labor, because people had already lived in that region for thousands of years. In 1921, a company in the fishing business established the cannery there, and it drew its workforce from the long-resident indigenous communities of the area. Those people were the Sugpiaq, also known as the Alutiiq, an indigenous nation of southern Alaska whose homeland spans the Kenai Peninsula, the Kodiak Archipelago, and parts of the Alaska Peninsula. They had been there since long before any European ship ever appeared on the horizon, and this is where the story turns, because the people who knew that coast better than anyone alive had been saying something about those forests for generations. The cannery operators heard it, and they built their town anyway. What the Sugpiaq had been saying was not a casual thing. It was not a campfire story told to thrill children, the way outsiders would later want to file it. It was a warning, repeated across generations, carried in the oral tradition the way other cultures carry maps or laws, because it functioned as both. There was a creature in the interior, in the deep folds of those mountains and the black heart of that old-growth timber, and the elders had a name for it. They called it the Nantinak. And in the Sugpiaq language, that word translates roughly to something that should have made every newcomer pause before they ever stepped off the dock. It means, simply, the hairy one. Now, I want to be careful here, because it would be easy to flatten this into something familiar and lose what makes it strange. The Nantinak is not exactly the gentle, shy forest dweller of modern pop culture. The misunderstood giant ambling away from hikers in shaky cell phone footage. The way the elders described it, and this has been documented by Sugpiaq tradition bearers, by women who grew up hearing the stories firsthand, it was large. It walked upright, on two legs. It was covered in hair from head to foot. It belonged to the most remote country, the places people were not meant to go, and it was territorial. It was dangerous. It was, above all, something to be avoided. That last part matters more than anything. In the broader Pacific Northwest, the Sasquatch tradition often carries a note of reverence, even kinship, a being that keeps to itself, that means no harm if left alone. The Nantinak overlaps with that tradition, yes, but it does not sit comfortably inside it, because the Sugpiaq did not describe a spirit to be respected from a distance. They described a predator, something that hunted, something that, if it noticed you, might decide you were the reason it had come down out of the high country at all. That is a profoundly different thing. One is a ghost you tip your hat to. The other is a threat you organize your entire life around avoiding. And here is the detail that should stop you cold, the one that makes it impossible to wave all this away as a story invented to explain later tragedies. The references predate the tragedies by more than a century. When Russian fur traders and Orthodox missionaries began arriving on these coasts in the late 1700s, some of them wrote down fragments of what they heard, scattered second-hand notes about Sugpiaq traditions concerning large, dangerous, hair-covered beings said to live in the interior. Think about the arithmetic of that. Those references were recorded nearly 100 years before the United States even purchased Alaska. They were set down more than a century before anyone laid the first plank of the Portlock cannery. So whatever was being described, it was not a convenient legend cooked up in the 1930s to make sense of bodies pulled out of a creek. The tradition was already ancient. It was already a warning, and the people delivering that warning had no idea, could not possibly have known, that one day a town would rise on that exact stretch of coast and that the warning would seem to come true. But for a while, and this is the part that lulls you, nothing happened. The cannery's first decade reportedly passed without any major recorded incident. Picture it. The boats came in low in the water, silver with salmon. The processing lines ran through the long northern summer days, the air thick with the smell of brine and fish and wood smoke. Children went to the little school. People got sick and walked to the medical clinic. Letters went out from the post office, addressed to families in faraway places, postmarked Portlock, Alaska, a name that actually meant something then. Workers came with the season and left with it. The town grew toward its peak of around 150 souls, and for 10 years it was, by every measure, simply a town. A hard place to live, but an ordinary one. The warning, if anyone remembered it at all, must have started to feel like superstition. Old talk, the kind of thing the elders said that the young men nodded at and ignored. And then, in the early 1930s, something shifted. It did not announce itself. There was no single catastrophe. No night the whole town woke screaming. It started the way the worst things often start, with a single absence. A man went into the forest and did not come back. Now, in Alaska, that alone is not extraordinary, and I need you to sit with that because it's central to everything that follows. The Alaskan bush is genuinely, relentlessly deadly, bears the size of small cars. Hypothermia that can kill you in summer if your clothes get wet and the wind comes up. Rivers that look calm and pull you under in seconds. Cliffs hidden behind a screen of brush. People die out there. People who know better die out there. So when the first man failed to return, you can imagine the grim, practical response of a fishing community. A search, a shaking of heads, a hard truth accepted. The country took him, except it kept happening. And the men it took were not the careless ones, not the green seasonal hires fresh off the boat who didn't know a devil's club from a spruce. The men who disappeared were experienced woodsmen, loggers, cannery workers who had hunted and trapped that ground for years, who knew every drainage and game trail and tidal flat for miles. They knew where the bears denned and where the footing went bad. They knew, in their bodies, the 1,000 small rules that keep you alive in that country. And they vanished anyway, and not in the conditions you'd expect to lose a man. Not in a whiteout. Not in a flood. They vanished in calm weather, in broad daylight, on familiar routes they'd walked 100 times before. The kind of conditions where a seasoned person simply does not disappear, where if you got hurt, you'd be found, where if you got turned around, you'd find your way back by nightfall. And then the bodies began to come back. Not all of them. Some of the missing were never recovered at all, swallowed whole by that green country. But some turned up, washed into the streams, or laid out on the tidal flats by the retreating sea. And when the people of Portlock looked at what the water had given back, they saw injuries that the men who examined them could not explain in any ordinary way. That was the moment the old warning stopped being old talk. That was the moment the elder's word for the thing in the high country began, quietly, to pass from mouth to mouth again, in kitchens and on the docks, in the dark before sleep, Nantinak. Because whatever had done this to a body was not, they would come to insist, anything a bear had done. And to understand why they were so certain of that, you have to understand exactly what a bear leaves behind, and exactly how these wounds refuse to match it. A bear attack has a signature. Ask any guide, any trapper, any rural Alaskan who has seen the aftermath, and they will describe the same thing, because a bear kills and feeds in a way that leaves a recognizable language written on flesh. There are the claws. Long parallel furrows, 4 or 5 of them, raked across the body where the animal swiped. There are the punctures, the deep round bites where the jaws closed, often at the skull or the back of the neck, the killing grip. There is feeding damage, focused and purposeful. The body opened in the places a bear opens a body. It is brutal and it is unmistakable, and the men of that coast had seen it before. They knew what a bear left behind because they had buried friends a bear had left behind. This was not that. The bodies that came out of the Portlock streams, by every account that has come down to us, carried a different kind of damage entirely. Not the rake of claws, not the puncture of teeth. Crushing. Blunt force trauma. Bones broken in ways that spoke of enormous force applied all at once. The kind of injury you'd expect from a man struck by a falling tree, or thrown against rock from a great height, or hit by something with the strength of a machine. Limbs wrenched, skulls caved. The geometry of the wounds was wrong for any predator they knew. A bear tears and bites. Whatever this was, it struck, and it threw, and it did so with a power that the people examining the remains could not assign to any animal they could name. Sit with that distinction, because the whole mystery turns on it. A clawed body is a bear. A bitten body is a bear. But a body that has been broken, crushed, battered, hurled, by something with overwhelming strength and apparently no interest in feeding the ordinary way. That is a different problem. That is the kind of thing that does not let a community sleep. And the people of Portlock, who knew their own backyard better than any outsider ever would, looked at those broken men and reached a conclusion that the rest of the world would spend the next century trying to argue them out of. They decided the elders had been right. They decided the thing on the mountain was real and that it had come down. Because by then, you have to understand, the deaths were not the only thing. The deaths were the worst thing, but they were not the only thing. People had begun to see it. At first, it was the kind of sighting easy to dismiss in daylight and hard to forget at dusk. A worker glancing up from the cutting line would catch, at the very edge of the tree line, a shape, large, upright, standing where a man might stand if a man were 8 or 9 feet tall and covered head to foot in dark hair. It would be there for the length of a held breath, watching the cannery, watching the people. And then it would be gone, withdrawn back into the green so fast and so silent that you could half convince yourself you'd imagined it. People reported figures that moved wrong, that crossed open ground faster than any bear they'd seen, low and fluid and upright at once, dark shapes that flickered between the trunks and were gone before a rifle could be raised. And the sightings did not stay out at the tree line where you could pretend they belonged to the wild. That is the detail that chills the people who study this place, because it speaks to something that the legend itself warns about: boldness, a growing, deliberate boldness. The figures began to be seen closer, on the trails near the houses, at the edge of the clearing where the children played, and then, according to the accounts that survived, on the docks themselves, within the community. In the heart of the place, where the boats came in and the salmon were unloaded and the lamps were lit at night, people began to report the sense, and sometimes the sight, of something standing just beyond the light. Something tall and silent and patient, watching the village the way a thing watches what it has decided belongs to it. You cannot live like that. No community can. There is a particular kind of fear that does not announce itself in a single dramatic night but settles in slowly, like cold coming up through the floorboards, until one day you realize it has become the air you breathe. That is what happened to Portlock through the late 1930s and into the 40s. It was not a panic, it was an erosion. A family would leave after a season, not running, just deciding not to come back. A worker who had fished there for a decade would take a job in another inlet and never explain too closely why. The men who'd been willing to go up the drainages to log and hunt grew fewer, and then there were none, because the ground that fed the cannery had become ground that no one would walk. And a fishing settlement that cannot send its people into the country around it is a settlement that is already dying. It just doesn't know the date yet. The numbers tell the story without a single ghost in them. a community that had once held something near 150 souls, with its school and its clinic and its post office and the busy, ordinary clatter of a working town, began year by year to drain away. Fewer children in the schoolhouse, fewer boats at the dock, fewer lamps lit at night, until the dark spaces between the lit windows grew wider, and the forest pressed a little closer each season, patient as it had always been. And here is where the story takes a turn that lifts it out of folklore and plants it uncomfortably in the official record. Because Portlock's troubles arrived at a moment when the wider world had a reason to be paying attention. The Second World War came to Alaska. The territory, so often treated as a frozen afterthought, suddenly mattered enormously because it sat astride the northern approaches and the Japanese had landed in the Aleutians, and the whole vast coast became, overnight, a theater of war. The army moved personnel across the territory. Watchers, engineers, men assigned to guard the lonely entrances to strategically vital waters, and Portlock sat near one of those entrances, close to the mouth of Cook Inlet, the long sea road up toward Anchorage, which meant that, for the first time, the strange deaths in a tiny, vanishing cannery town were not solely the business of grieving locals and skeptical regional officials. They became, at least for a moment, the business of the United States military. Investigators were dispatched, reports were written, and what those reports did and did not say is one of the most telling parts of this entire account, because the men who wrote them were not romantics. They were not steeped in Sugpiaq oral tradition. They were practical men with orders, trained to look for the ordinary causes of an extraordinary thing. A man with a grudge, a still gone wrong, a sabotage cell, a smuggling ring, an enemy agent, and by every account that survives, that is exactly what they went looking for. They walked the streams, they examined what could be examined, they listened to the men on the docks who still had not left. And the surviving documentation, as it has been described, records the disappearances plainly, methodically, without flourish, and then closes the file without an answer. No criminal activity established. No human cause identified, no evidence of the kind of organized predation a person commits, and, just as pointedly, no conclusion that these were ordinary bear attacks. The army, in other words, came to the most haunted clearing on the Kenai Peninsula, looked hard with sober eyes, and went away unable to name what had been killing people there. That silence in the record is louder than any scream in the legend, because it eliminates, with the weight of official disinterest, the very theories that a skeptic would reach for first. So let us do what the investigation could not, and walk those theories into the light one at a time, and watch each one fail. Start with the kindest explanation, the one that requires nothing strange at all: economic decline. Canneries closed all over Alaska as the industry consolidated. Surely Portlock was just one more victim of fish prices and bigger operations down coast. It is a tidy theory, and it is wrong, and the reason it is wrong is in the manner of the leaving. Economic death is gradual and orderly. A company downsizes, it sells its equipment, families relocate with notice, with plans, carrying what they can sell and selling what they cannot carry. That is not what happened at Portlock. The last families did not liquidate. They did not formally shutter their businesses or transfer their property. In 1949 and into 1950, they simply left, walked away from buildings and boats and the bones of a life, and did not come back, and told the people who asked that they had gone because they were afraid. People do not abandon property they could sell because the salmon market softened. They abandon it because staying has become unthinkable. Then there is the bear, always the bear, in Alaska, and a fair suspicion, because the brown bears of the Kenai are enormous and lethal and entirely real. But we have already seen why the bear does not fit. A bear announces itself in the wounds it leaves, the raking parallel lines of the claws, the deep punctures of the jaw, the feeding. The bodies recovered near Portlock were described again and again in the language of crushing, of bones broken by force, of trauma consistent with being struck or flung by something of overwhelming strength, not torn by something hungry. And a bear does not stand at the tree line and watch a cannery. A bear does not appear on the docks, inside the settlement, in the lit places where men are, and then withdraw. That is not the behavior of an animal that fears us. That is the behavior of something that does not. And the last refuge of the rational mind, a human killer, a man hiding in that country, picking off woodsmen one by one. It is the theory the Army would most have wanted to find, and the one it most clearly did not. Consider the logistics. There were no roads. There are still no roads. A killer would have had to arrive by boat or float plane, supply himself in a wilderness weeks from the nearest law, evade armed and capable woodsmen on their own ground for the better part of 2 decades, and leave bodies marked not by blade or bullet, but by the kind of blunt, massive force a single human being cannot generate. It does not work. It has never worked. And so we are left, having dismissed the comfortable answers, standing where the Sugpiaq elders stood from the very beginning, looking at the tree line. This is Professor Edmund Quinn, and here is what the long arc of this story finally asks us to consider. Portlock does not sit alone. It belongs to a vast, continent-spanning web of testimony. The Kushtaka of the Tlingit, the traditions of the Dena'ina and the Yupik and the Inupiat across Alaska, the Salish and 100 other First Nations down through the Pacific Northwest, all describing the same impossible neighbor, large, hair-covered, walking upright, reclusive, and best left alone. And in 1967, a strip of film captured something walking along a creek in Northern California that frame by frame and biomechanical study has never been able to dismiss as a man in a costume. Independent researchers have since gone back to Portlock itself, recorded the oral histories before the last witnesses passed, documented track impressions pressed deep into wet ground, strange woven structures of bent saplings, calls in the dark that no catalogued animal makes. A television series brought the world's eyes to that drowned little town and called what lived there by the name the survivors gave it. And here is the twist that makes Portlock heavier than any cryptid story you have ever heard. Most legends give you a blurry photograph and a feeling. Portlock gives you a body count. It gives you a school that emptied, a post office struck from the registry, families who chose fear over a paid-for home, and a clearing that the forest has been allowed to swallow for 75 years because no human being will set a roof there again. The mystery was never whether something is out there. The people who knew that coast best never doubted it. The real mystery, the one that should unsettle you long after this video ends, is why, with a town's worth of evidence on the table, the institutions we trust to explain the world simply look away and decline to engage. And one thread refuses to lie still. If economics did not empty Portlock, if the people fled in fear of something they would name only in their own language, then somewhere in that rotting clearing, beneath 75 years of moss and fallen spruce, the truth is still standing exactly where they left it. Patient, as the forest is patient, waiting. So I want to hear from you. Do you accept the official silence, that the Army looked, found nothing, and the town simply died of bad luck and falling fish prices? Or do you believe the elders were right all along, and Portlock was abandoned because something there could not be reasoned with? Tell me below, and if a real American town can be emptied by what walks that coast, where do you think it would happen next?